Welcome to our deep dive. We're tackling a real head-scratcher today, the cosmological argument. We got some pretty thought-provoking stuff from you guys on this one, and we're excited to, well, dive in.
It's a question that's been a real puzzler for, well, forever, it seems. Why is there something instead of just nothing? That's where the cosmological argument comes in, trying to make sense of it all. It's saying, hey, look, the universe exists. It's got to mean there's something necessary, something that has to exist. And, a lot of folks connect that with, well, God.
So it's like even bigger than just figuring out where trees come from or how planets form. This is about like the baseline of everything, right?
Yeah.
Why is there anything at all?
Yeah, exactly. It's getting at that ultimate foundation. And the cosmological argument, well, it's saying that a universe like ours, one that could have just as easily not existed, it needs a reason, a cause, something that has to exist, not just something that happens to.
I'm starting to see the scope of this, but I feel like to really wrap our heads around it, we need some backstory, right?
Yeah.
A little history of how this idea developed. Where do we even begin?
Well, the roots go way back, ancient Greece, think Plato, Aristotle, those guys. But it really took off in medieval Islamic philosophy, where thinkers like Ibn Sina really dug into the idea of contingency, and Al-Ghazali explored this Kalam cosmological argument, which is all about how you can't have this infinite chain of causes going back forever.
So we're already seeing different flavors of this argument popping up, even way back then.
Oh, absolutely. And those different threads, they run all the way through to today. Later on, you have big names like Thomas Aquinas, Gottfried Leibniz, and René Descartes, all wrestling with these ideas, adding their own twists, refining the arguments.
And I bet there were some folks along the way who weren't buying it, right? Every good argument has its critics. What were some of the big pushbacks against the cosmological argument?
Oh, tons. You can't talk about this without bringing up David Hume and Immanuel Kant, those Enlightenment powerhouses. They had some serious critiques that still resonate today. And in the 20th century, it's like a resurgence, this renewed interest in the cosmological argument, with modern philosophers like Alvin Plantinga, William Lane Craig, and Richard Swinburne stepping up with sophisticated new versions of the old arguments.
So this isn't just some dusty old idea, huh? It's still got philosophers buzzing, even centuries later. But before we get too lost in the history, let's break down the different types of cosmological arguments. You mentioned deductive and inductive versions, right?
Right. Those are like the two main branches. Deductive arguments, they're all about proving God's existence, like a logical slam dunk. You accept the premises, you got to accept the conclusion, just like a math proof. Inductive arguments, on the other hand, they're more about finding the best explanation. They're saying, hey, the universe exists, it's got these specific features, and God is the most likely explanation for all of that.
So one's about certainty, the other's about probability. Is that a decent way to put it?
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And within each of those, you've got more variations. Like with the deductive arguments, some focus on the universe being contingent, others on needing a first cause in time. And then there's the principle of sufficient reason, this idea that everything has to have an explanation for why it exists.
Okay, that last one, the principle of sufficient reason. That's something I can really get behind. It just seems intuitive, right? If something's here, there's got to be a reason why.
It's a powerful idea, no doubt. And it's at the core of a lot of cosmological arguments. But like any philosophical principle, it's got its challengers. Hume, for example, he questioned whether we can really know that everything has a cause. He said, hey, we can imagine stuff happening without any cause, and if we can conceive it, it's got to be possible, right?
Wouldn't those who are in favor of this principle say, hey, even if you can imagine it, doesn't mean it's actually possible in the real world? Isn't there a difference between what we can think up and what can actually be?
Oh, yeah. That's the kind of debate that keeps philosophers up at night. And it's one that's still going strong. Some argue that our whole idea of causation comes from our experience, from observing the world, and that science itself is built on this principle. Others, well, they're not so sure. They ask, can we really take what we experience here and now and apply it to the whole universe, especially when we're talking about its very beginning?
So even this idea of causation, something we take for granted, it's got all these philosophical layers. I can see why this whole area is so fascinating. But before we get into all that, can we walk through the contingency argument itself? Like, how does that work?
Okay, so picture this. Imagine a world where everything that exists, it could have just as easily not existed. Trees, rocks, planets, you and me, we're all contingent beings. We depend on other stuff we could have easily never come to be.
All right, I'm following. We're all part of this, like, web of contingent things. But where does the argument go from there?
Well, it says this whole chain of contingent things, it can't just go on forever. There's got to be something that kicks it all off, something that explains why any of this exists in the first place. And that something, well, it can't be contingent itself. It has to be necessary, something that exists just by its very nature.
It's like a chain that needs a hook, right? The universe needs a solid foundation to hang on, something that's not going to just disappear.
That's a great way to put it. And this necessary being, well, a lot of folks connect it with God, a being that doesn't depend on anything else, who provides the ultimate explanation for why there's something rather than nothing.
I get it, but I'm sure someone out there is thinking, hold on, couldn't you just say the universe just is? Like, it's just a brute fact, end of story. No need for an explanation.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic counterargument. That's what Bertrand Russell argued. He said the universe just is, take it or leave it, no further explanation needed. But those defending the cosmological argument, they'd say, not so fast.
How would they push back on that? Would they say, hang on, the universe itself, isn't that contingent too? Like it could have easily not existed.
Exactly. If you took away all the contingent stuff in the universe itself would be gone too. And if something can cease to exist, that means it's contingent and it needs an explanation.
That makes sense. But even if we agree that the universe needs explaining, can't we just focus on explaining the individual parts?
Mm-hmm.
Like how galaxies form, how stars evolve. Why bring something outside the universe into it?
That's another popular objection. It's similar to what Hume thought. Explain the parts, you've explained the whole. But those who disagree, they argue that just explaining the parts isn't enough. We got to explain why those specific parts exist, why they're arranged the way they are, and why there are contingent things at all.
So it's not just about explaining the bricks. It's about explaining the blueprint, the architect, the whole reason there's a building in the first place.
Precisely. And that's where the cosmological argument comes in. It's trying to provide that ultimate explanation, saying there's this necessary, self-existent being at the foundation of everything. But of course, the debate goes on. There's still a lot to consider, and we'll dig into some of those challenges in the next part of our deep dive.
This is definitely getting the wheels turning. Can't wait to see what other twists and turns this philosophical road has in store.
Welcome back to the deep dive. You know, it's wild how this cosmological argument, it just touches on so many areas of philosophy, like metaphysics, epistemology, even philosophy of science and religion.
Yeah, it's definitely a rabbit hole. We've been looking at these like classic versions of the argument, but you sent us some material on a more modern take by Michael Almeida, and it involves, wait for it, a multiverse.
Oh yeah, Almeida's work, it definitely shakes things up. He's saying, look, to really explain the universe, we need a complete explanation, something absolute, no loose ends, no unexplained contingencies.
So he's upping the ante on what even counts as a good explanation.
Hmm.
So how does the multiverse come into play?
Almeida says, don't just look at our world, our universe. Think bigger. Consider all possible worlds, this huge collection of possibilities. It's what folks call the pluriverse.
Wait, so he's saying even possibilities, not just actual things, need to be explained. That's kind of blowing my mind.
Right. It's a big idea. And he argues that this pluriverse, this whole collection of possible worlds, it has to exist. It couldn't not exist. And if it's necessary, then using that strong principle of sufficient reason, well, it needs an absolute explanation, something that makes it all make sense.
So he's using this bigger, grander view of reality to make the case for a necessary being, the ultimate explanation for everything, even possibilities themselves.
That's it. For Almeida, this necessary being is the reason for the whole pluriverse. It's not just that God made this universe, it's that God's very being makes all possible worlds necessary.
Oh, but hang on a sec. If everything is ultimately explained by God's necessary existence, where does that leave free will? Does that mean everything is predetermined?
That's the million-dollar question, and Almeida tackles it head-on. He says, sure, the pluriverse itself is necessary, but within each possible world, you've still got contingency. It's like variations on a theme. Different possible worlds can have different properties, even if those properties are set within each world.
Like, okay, even though chess has specific rules, there are tons of different ways the game can play out, different moves, different outcomes.
Bingo. Almeida's view, this modal realism, it keeps all the richness and variety of possible worlds while still saying that God's existence is what makes any of it possible in the first place.
Definitely a head trip.
Yeah.
But I can see how it tries to address some of the usual objections to the cosmological argument. God's not competing with the universe for an explanation. God explains the very possibility of any universe at all. But I bet this view has its own share of critics, right?
Oh, for sure. Modal realism itself is a whole debate, and some argue that contingency in Almeida's system, well, it doesn't really mean much if everything ultimately comes down to God's necessity. It's a complex issue, lots of back and forth.
Okay, so we've got this strong version of the principle of sufficient reason, leading to a necessary pluriverse with God as the explainer. What about a weaker version? I know philosophers Gale and Press have a different take on this.
Yeah, Gale and Press, they offer what they call a modal cosmological argument, and it uses a less strict principle of sufficient reason. They say it's possible that every true statement has an explanation, not that it necessarily does.
So it's a less demanding starting point. Does that lead them to a less demanding idea of God?
You could say that they're not trying to prove the all-powerful, all-knowing God of traditional theology. Their conclusion is more like there's a powerful designer creator, but maybe there are limits to what this being can do or know.
That's interesting. It sounds like they're trying to address that whole problem of evil, right? The idea that if God is all good and all powerful, why is there so much suffering?
Yeah, that could be part of their motivation. But their argument really hinges on this difference between contingent and necessary propositions. Contingent stuff might be true in some worlds, false in others. Necessary stuff, it's true in all worlds. And they say if it's even possible for a supernatural being to exist necessarily, then that being must actually exist in all worlds, including ours.
Hold up. How do they get from possibly necessary to actually necessary? Seems like a big jump there.
That's where their weak principle of sufficient reason comes in. They say even if the statement about a necessary being is contingent, meaning it could be true or false depending on the world you're in, it still needs some kind of explanation. And if no natural explanation works, well, then a supernatural one is the most likely option.
So even if we can't say for sure that a necessary being must exist in all worlds, the fact that it could exist in some is enough to justify a supernatural explanation. I get how they're using a weaker principle to still reach a pretty strong conclusion, but I bet this approach has critics too, right?
You bet. Some philosophers say their argument is kind of murky. Like, how do you even describe that explaining proposition Gale and Press are talking about? If the explanation itself is contingent, then it's like we're just kicking the can down the road.
It's like saying something must have explained this, but I have no idea what, so let's call it a supernatural being. It's a bit of a placeholder, you know?
Yeah, that's one way to see it. And then there's Graham Oppy, who, as you know, loves to take on cosmological arguments. He says, listen, accepting this weak principle of sufficient reason, it's going to lead you right back to the strong principle and a necessary being anyway. So it doesn't really help those who don't believe in God.
So it's like a philosophical switcheroo, starting weak but ending up with a strong conclusion anyway.
That's Oppy's take. And it's funny because even Gale and Press admit that their argument might actually point to a being that's basically omnipotent and omniscient, not that different from the God of traditional arguments.
So no matter which road we take, we keep ending up at this idea of a necessary being, something that sounds a lot like God. But what about those arguments that focus on the universe having a beginning? That's the Kalam cosmological argument, right?
Exactly. The Kalam argument, William Lane Clegg is the big name here. It shifts focus from the contingency thing to the idea that the universe had a starting point in time. If it began to exist, then according to the Kalam argument, it's got to have a cause.
All right, let's break that down. What are the main pieces of the Kalam argument?
It's got two key claims. First, anything that starts to exist has to have a cause. Second, the universe had a beginning. If those are both true, then the Kalam argument says, boom, the universe must have a cause.
Sounds pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
But something tells me both of those claims are, shall we say, debatable.
Oh, yeah, totally. The idea of causation itself and whether the universe actually had a beginning, those are both hotly contested. We'll get into those debates right after.
No breaks. Let's ride this philosophical wave. What are some of the big objections to the Kalam argument?
All right, so one big challenge comes from quantum physics. Some ways of understanding quantum mechanics suggest that stuff happening at the subatomic level might be totally random, no cause at all, and that goes against the first part of the Kalam argument. Everything that begins to exist has a cause.
So we're talking about those weird quantum events where particles can just pop in and out of existence seemingly out of nowhere.
Yep, that's the kind of stuff that really makes you wonder if this idea of causation holds up, especially at the most fundamental level of reality.
That throws a pretty big wrench in the Kalam argument, doesn't it? How do those who defend it respond to that?
Craig, he's the Kalam argument's biggest champion. He says even those quantum events have causal conditions, even if we can't totally determine them. And he also makes a distinction between predicting something and it having a cause. Just because we can't predict those quantum events perfectly doesn't mean they don't have a cause.
It's like saying, yeah, I can't tell you exactly where the roulette ball is going to land, but that doesn't mean it's not caused by the spinning wheel and the laws of physics, right?
Right. But of course, not everyone's on board with Craig's interpretation. Some folks see that quantum randomness as a fundamental part of reality, and that would really challenge the idea of causation as we usually think of it.
So it all comes down to whether those quantum events are truly random or if there's some deeper causal structure we just don't understand yet. We're getting into some pretty heavy stuff here. But for argument's sake, let's say the causal principle holds up. What about that second part of the Kalam argument, saying the universe had a beginning? Isn't that also up for debate?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Those who criticize the Kalam argument, they often say, hold on, we don't actually know for sure that the universe had a beginning. There might be other cosmological models out there that allow for a universe without a beginning, or maybe our current physics just can't tell us for sure.
So it's not as simple as pointing at the Big Bang and saying, case closed.
Nope. The Big Bang is the main theory we've got, but it doesn't necessarily settle the beginning question. Some physicists say that initial singularity, that point of infinite density and temperature where the universe supposedly started, maybe that wasn't even a real event. Maybe it's just the limit of what we can understand right now.
Like we can trace things back to that point, but what happened before that? Or even if before makes sense in that context. Who knows?
Exactly. And some other theories, like those cyclic universe ideas, they say the Big Bang wasn't a true beginning, but just a transition point in this endless cycle of expansion and contraction. So yeah, the whole universe with a definite beginning idea, it's not settled science.
Okay, so lots of uncertainty around causation and whether the universe even had a beginning. But let's say for a minute that the Kalam argument is right. If the universe did have a beginning, and if that beginning needs a cause, what can we say about that cause?
Now we're getting to the really interesting part. Craig argues that this cause has to be personal.
Personal. What does that even mean when we're talking about the universe? Is he saying some conscious being, like with intentions, created the universe?
That's exactly what he's saying. Craig says, listen, science can't explain the origin of the universe completely. There has to be a being who chose to create, a being with the power and intention to make the universe happen.
So it's not like some random quantum event or an impersonal law of physics that got things going. It's like a conscious, deliberate act.
That's how Craig sees it. He thinks this being exists outside of space and time, not bound by the same laws of physics as the universe, and capable of acting freely to bring the universe into existence.
Whoa, that's a big claim. But I bet this whole personal cause idea raises even more questions, right?
Oh, for sure. Like, if this being is outside of space and time, how can we even picture it acting within time to create the universe? And if it's so powerful, why is there so much bad stuff happening in the world? These are just some of the questions that philosophers are still wrestling with.
So even if the Kalam argument makes a good case that the universe needs a cause, it opens up a whole new can of worms.
Totally. But that's what's so cool about the cosmological argument. It's been around for centuries, and it's still sparking debate and making us think really hard.
We've covered a ton of ground here, from ancient Greek ideas to modern cosmology and even the multiverse. We've looked at different versions of the cosmological argument, from contingency to the Kalam argument, and we've seen how each one faces its own set of challenges. What are some key takeaways for those listening who are trying to wrap their heads around all this?
I think a big takeaway is this. The cosmological argument, in all its forms, it shows how humans keep trying to answer these huge questions about existence. Why is there something instead of nothing? What's reality all about? Is there something beyond the physical universe?
It's a good reminder that philosophy isn't just some abstract thing. It's about trying to understand the deepest mysteries of the universe and our place in it.
Exactly. And even if we don't come up with definite answers, just thinking about these questions, it can be really rewarding. It makes us examine what we take for granted, to think critically and creatively, and to appreciate how complex and amazing the universe is.
So even if we don't finish this deep dive with a firm belief in God or a perfect understanding of how the universe began, we've hopefully gained a better appreciation for how powerful and deep philosophical inquiry can be.
Absolutely. Who knows, maybe exploring these arguments will spark your own philosophical journey. You might end up with insights you never thought possible.
That's what a deep dive is all about. But our exploration of the cosmological argument isn't over just yet. There's one more fascinating approach we need to talk about. It focuses on this idea of finding the best explanation. called the inductive cosmological argument, and it's led by a modern philosopher, Richard Swinburne. We'll dive into that in the next part of our deep dive. Welcome back to our deep dive into the cosmological argument. I feel like we've gone through some pretty intense philosophical terrain already. The contingency argument, the Kalam argument, even the multiverse. It's a lot to take in.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground. But there's still one more approach we need to explore, and it's a bit different from the others. It's called the inductive cosmological argument. And it's all about finding the best explanation, not necessarily an airtight proof. Richard Swinburne is the main guy behind this one.
Inference to the best explanation. That sounds pretty interesting. It seems like we're shifting gears from, like, strict logic to weighing evidence and making judgments about what makes the most sense. Am I on the right track?
Yeah, you got it. Swinburne, he's not trying to give you a knockdown, drag-out logical proof of God's existence. He's saying, look, we've got this universe, it's got these specific features, and the best way to explain all that is by saying, there's a God who designed it.
So it's kind of like detective work.
Right.
Gather the clues, look at the suspects, and figure out who's the most likely culprit.
Exactly. And in this case, the crime we're trying to solve is the existence of the universe itself. Swinburne says, look at all the evidence, and God, as this powerful, intelligent creator, well, that's the best explanation we've got.
But haven't we already been talking about arguments that say the universe needs a cause? How's Swinburne's argument different?
He's not just focusing on the universe existing, but on the specifics, the details, the features of the universe. He's saying these features point to a designer and intelligence behind it all.
So what kind of features are we talking about? What makes the universe look designed?
Well, for one thing, Swinburne points to how ordered and regular the universe is. The laws of physics, they're incredibly consistent no matter where you look in the universe. And those laws, well, they're what lead to all those complex structures we see, from galaxies and stars to planets and, life itself.
Okay, I can see how that might suggest some kind of, like, underlying plan or purpose. What else?
He also talks a lot about fine-tuning. You know how a lot of the fundamental constants in physics, like the strength of gravity or the mass of an electron, if they were even slightly different, the universe wouldn't be able to support life as we know it.
Oh yeah, the anthropic principle, right. It's like the universe is tailor-made for us.
That's it. And Swinburne sees this fine-tuning as really strong evidence for a designer. He says it's way more likely that the universe was intentionally set up for life than that it just happened to have the right conditions by pure chance.
But I could see someone saying, well, we only know about one universe, right?
Yeah.
How do we know this fine-tuning is so special? Maybe there are zillions of other universes with different constants, and we just happen to live in the one that works for life.
That's the multiverse idea, and it's a common counter to the fine-tuning argument. But Swinburne says, okay, even if there are other universes, you still gotta explain why this universe exists with these specific constants. And to him, a designer is a simpler, more straightforward explanation than a multiverse that we have no direct evidence for.
So it's easier to say a mind created this universe on purpose than to say it just popped into existence along with a bunch of others. I get how that could be appealing, looking for the simplest answer.
Simplicity is a big deal for Swinburne. He uses this thing called Bayes' theorem. It's a mathematical way to update probabilities based on new evidence. He argues that even if we're not sure about the probability of God existing beforehand, once we look at the universe and all its features, well, the probability that God is the best explanation, it goes way up.
So the more we learn about the universe and how intricate it is, the more likely it seems that there's a mind behind it all.
That's Swinburne's argument. He's saying God, as this simple, eternal, all-powerful being, is a more elegant explanation than a universe that's complex, constantly changing, and dependent on all sorts of factors. It's like, it makes more sense to say a complicated machine was built by a smart engineer than to say it just put itself together randomly.
But I bet some people would say, hang on, isn't it simpler to just stick with naturalism? The idea that the universe is all there is and everything can be explained by natural processes. Isn't that the simplest explanation?
Oh yeah, for sure, that's a classic objection. Critics of Swinburne say, hey, naturalism needs fewer moving parts, fewer assumptions. Introducing God just complicates things unnecessarily.
It's like that Occam's razor thing, right?
Right.
The idea that the simplest explanation is usually the best. So they're saying, get rid of God, and you've got a cleaner, more straightforward explanation.
Right. And that gets us into this whole debate about what simplicity even means. Is it simpler to have one super complex being God? Or is it simpler to just focus on the universe we can see and try to explain its complexity through natural processes, even if those processes are super complicated themselves?
This is giving me a philosophical headache. It's like
Mm.
every time we simplify one part of the explanation, another part gets more complex. But even if we say, okay, Swinburne's argument is pretty strong, does it really get us to the God of religion? The God of love, justice, mercy, that kind of thing.
That's a really important point, and it shows the limits of what the cosmological argument can do on its own. Even if it convinces you that there's a powerful, intelligent creator, it doesn't necessarily tell you anything about this creator's personality or how we should relate to it.
So the cosmological argument, it's maybe like a starting point, showing us there's something fundamental behind everything, but it doesn't give us the whole picture of what that something is like or how we fit into the story.
That's one way to think about it. If you want to go from a philosophical idea of a necessary being to the God of religion, well, you'd need to look at other arguments and evidence. Things like religious experiences, the problem of evil, the nature of morality. That's a whole other deep dive.
It feels like we've only dipped our toes into this vast ocean of philosophical ideas. We've gone from ancient Greece to modern cosmology. We've tangled with causation, pondered the multiverse, and explored all these different ways of thinking about the universe and reality.
It's been quite a journey. And even though we don't have all the answers, I think we've come away with a better understanding of just how complex and deep these philosophical debates are. The cosmological argument, it keeps challenging us to think critically and creatively about our place in the universe and what it all means.
It reminds us that philosophy is more about the journey than reaching a final destination. And even if we don't reach some peak of absolute certainty, the journey itself is what makes it all worthwhile.
Well said. So next time you look up at the stars and feel that sense of awe and wonder, remember that philosophers have been pondering those same mysteries for centuries, and the conversation is still going strong.
And that's a wrap on our deep dive into the cosmological argument. We hope you enjoyed exploring these mind-bending ideas with us. We'll be back next time with a brand new deep dive, so be sure to join us then.